This week on the Holy Bold podcast. Stop oppressing snakes, you bigots. PETA tells us how to be more inclusive of animals. We discuss the worldly philosophies that are killing our society. And I invite you to rate the podcast. Do you like it? Share it. Give me 5 stars. All those cool things. Thank you so much for joining. Very glad that you are here. Welcome to the Holy Bold podcast. Welcome. As I said, this is the Holy Bold podcast. I am so glad that you are tuned in. And this really is sort of the first kind of regular episode of the podcast. Up until now, each of our main episodes have been walking through what I mean by the terminology holy and bold. So, that obviously that's the title of the podcast, Holy Bold Podcast. And so I wanted to describe in those first 4 episodes what exactly I mean by those things. And so we talked about holiness in 2 episodes, God's holiness. Then we talked about man's holiness in an episode. And then we talked about boldness in an episode. And so we've kind of walked through those things now. And so hopefully by this point, if you've listened to those, you mostly understand where I'm coming from and kind of my point of view. And from here on out, we're just kind of on to our regularly scheduled programming, just kind of the normal stuff that we will be addressing on this podcast on a regular basis. And of course, we're going to try to come at all of these various topics, the things that will come up through a Christian, bold, holy sort of mindset. But we're not just going to exclusively talk only about holiness and boldness. And so this week we're kicking things off with what probably will come across as a relatively weird topic. But before we get that, I want to tell you a little bit about just kind of the format of the podcast going forward. So each episode I will have a main segment that I'll be focusing on. And those segments will have various names that will each have sort of different themes. And so under each of those segments, I'll be addressing kind of one theme of topics. So like one segment that I'm really excited about, it's not the one I'm doing tonight, but one that I'm really looking forward to is called The Chapter House. And in that segment, which I'll do every once in a while, we will discuss one chapter, or I might not always hold myself directly just to one chapter, but one portion of a book. And I think it could occasionally be a book of the Bible, but it's called the Chapter House because we will be discussing ideas that I think are really useful and helpful out of a chapter of a book. And then, probably I'll usually recommend the book to you. However, those will not always be good books. Sometimes we'll be looking at a chapter out of a book that is terrible. I've already got a few on the docket that I think are books that are worth looking at, not because they tell us, good biblical truth, but because we need to understand the ideologies, the philosophies of the world. And so we're going to occasionally look at some of those sorts of things, and we will respond to them from a biblical worldview. So there's Chapter House. Another one's going to be dubious doctrines, doctrines that are being promoted in the church, or even sometimes maybe outside the church, but doctrines that are being promoted that if we compare them to the light of Scripture, we will see that they are not actually good doctrines. And so we're going to, every once in a while, we'll look at one of those, and that will be a segment called Dubious Doctrines. Another one is Heretical Hot Takes. Now, this one will mostly be looking probably at like tweets, Facebook posts, things like that people make that are heretical or at least very unbiblical. We shouldn't throw around the term heretical too loosely, and so I will clarify, if I end up talking about one that's not technically heresy, I'll let you know that. But we're going to look at some of those sorts of things that are, just in our social media age, we are so quick to just kind of put our thoughts out there, and very often they are not biblical, and they need to be responded to from a biblical worldview so that they don't lead people astray. And so, heretical hot takes. One that I'm really excited for, and we'll do somewhat regularly, I think, is going to be called Holy Bold History. And that one, you can get an idea probably from the name, but history. So we're going to be looking at people throughout history. They could be Bible characters. Very often, I think most often, they'll be people from throughout church history who were holy and bold, and they give us a good example of what it means for us to be holy and bold. God has given us many who have gone before us, who we can learn from and grow as we understand and are encouraged by, what motivated them and the course of action that they took in their lives. And so, Holy Bold History, that's one that I'm excited for. But this week, we are doing one that I think might end up being, just because of the state of the world, this one might be the one that comes up most often. And it is called Death of the West. And this particular segment is just going to be mainly looking at those things that would seem to indicate that the West, Western society, the society that you and I, well, most likely, I don't think anyone outside of the West listens to this podcast, our society seems to be crumbling. That's not a good thing. I don't take delight in that or pleasure in that, but I think it's true, and I think we should address and understand the things that are degrading the West, our society, so that we can combat those things. And so every once in a while, we'll do the segment called Death of the West, and we will address some of those things. So without further ado, let's jump into our first segment, the Death of the West. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, we are going to be addressing in this episode of the Death of the West a tweet that came from PETA. I mentioned that PETA has been telling us to stop oppressing the snakes. Now, obviously, that is a bit of a silly phrase to throw out there. So what I'm referring to is a tweet that came out earlier this week. And usually I would try to respond to things like this more quickly, but my normal schedule of recording is to record on Thursdays, release on Fridays. And so, that is just where we're at. And oddly enough, even though this is what you're going to see, this is a very silly tweet, not really to be taken very seriously. I do think that this tweet from PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, it does exemplify a deeper worldview issue, and that's why I would include it in this Death of the West category or segment, because even though obviously I don't think the West is going to die because PETA tweeted something stupid, I do think that the worldview that this tweet represents is very damaging to the West. And when I say West, I'm referring to like Western society, the society that you and I live in. I'm assuming that there's no one outside of Western society who is listening to this podcast. So I think it's a safe assumption to say that you live here. And so you should be concerned about the various things in our world or our society that are degrading the foundations of our society. And I think this tweet represents something that is sort of part of a greater movement that is sort of chipping away at the foundations of Western society. And I don't romanticize, Western society. I don't think it's perfect. I think there are definitely issues with it. But I do think that in large part, it is founded on the Christian worldview. And I think that in many ways, there are features of Western society that are good and we should desire to maintain. Even Jeremiah, when he writes to the exiles in Babylon, he tells them to pray for the peace of the city where God has taken you. Well, they were exiles in a hostile empire, and God told them to pray for that empire, And so if the Jewish exiles can pray for a hostile empire and the emperor who oversaw it, then we, as Christians living in the modern West, should not desire to see the West fall or to be destroyed, but instead we should pray for the peace of our society, the peace of the West, that the West would prosper and grow and become more like God describes how a society should be. And I think there are lots of worldviews that are prevalent right now that would lead us further away from God's plan for human society rather than lead us closer to it. And I think, obviously, again, as I said, this tweet does not constitute the destruction of Western society, but I do think that it exemplifies a move away from the good facets of Western society. There are plenty of facets of Western society that I think need to change. But this is chipping away at the good parts of Western society. So without further ado, here is the tweet. Words, and again, this is from PETA's official account. They said this: words can create a more inclusive world or perpetuate oppression. Calling someone an animal as an insult reinforces the myth that humans are superior to other animals and justified in violating them. Stand up for justice by rejecting supremacist language. And then they gave us, maybe you've already seen this, they gave us a helpful chart to give us kind of substitutes. So rather, than calling somebody the name of an animal as an insult, they give you a different term to use instead of the name of the animal. So let's look at this chart, mainly just because it's silly. We're not going to get a lot of philosophical depth out of this chart, be forewarned. Here's the chart. So it says, using animals as insults perpetuates speciesism. So, of course, they are kind of latching on to the prominent ideology of our day, where if you just throw ism on the end of anything, obviously that's a bad thing that only backwards, Christian folk would do, and it's bad and you shouldn't do it. So they say speciesism. And something interesting. The term speciesism, it sounds like a newfangled, they just put it together in order to kind of fit in with the modern social justice movement. And I do think that is generally why they're using it. But it actually goes all the way back to, I believe it was a 1975 or 76 book. I'm blanking on which of those 2 years it is, by Peter Singer, called Animal Liberation. And this is actually the book that the founder of PETA read, that kind of led her to found PETA. So this book is very important, and this book is the first place where the term speciesism is used. And so this book is all about animal liberation. It's about animal... well, it's funny because the author who wrote it actually, I guess, rejects the idea of animal rights because he rejects the whole concept of rights. I'm not going to get into the philosophical depths. I don't actually know all of them, of why this guy rejects the idea of rights, but he does think that animals, should be treated well, and obviously Christians don't disagree with that. You should treat animals well, but he popularized in his book Animal Liberation this phrase speciesism. And of course, the phrase is kind of meant to relate to, or it's analogous to the phrase racism. So race, ism is the idea that one so-called race. I don't really think there are multiple races. There's a human race, and then within that there are ethnicities. But in common parlance, the term racism is meant to describe somebody who thinks that because they are a certain race or ethnicity, they are better, or that specifically that another race or ethnicity is, inferior. So, speciesism is kind of a play off of racism, and suggests that, obviously, just the word itself suggests that it is incorrect to say that any one species is better than another species, or more, is superior to another species. Now, obviously, in the case of racism, that's true. There is no one ethnicity that is superior to the others. We are all equally made in the image of God. We all are not children of God, really, because you're only a child of God if you have faith in Christ. That is how you become a child of God. But every human being is made in the image of God. And therefore, all human beings have equal dignity before God. And so, of course, racism is wrong, because it's based on a foundationally wrong assumption, which is that one ethnicity or race is superior to another. And that is just ontologically untrue. Ontology being the study of being. There is nothing in the being of a white person that makes them superior to a black person. So racism or ethnicism, or whatever you might want to call it, is actually wrong. But then they kind of port, for this term speciesism, they port it, those categories over to species. And they say, the assumption behind it is, well, there is no one species, just like there is no one race that is superior to the others. And obviously, that is incorrect. That is simply not what the Bible teaches. And what's crazy to me is that no person actually thinks that every species has equal value and dignity. Nobody actually thinks that. If you ask any, there are obvious sociopaths and insane people who would get this question wrong. But if you ask I would say 99.9% of people, if you had to choose between killing one person or two dogs, which would you choose? One human being or two dogs, which would you choose? Now, according to the mindset that's being promoted here by PETA, that dogs and people, or animals and people, are of the same inherent value and dignity, well, then there's no logical reason for them to say that you shouldn't kill the one person. Because they would have to say, well, dogs, people, they're both equal. They have the same value. So two dogs are twice as valuable as one person. So we should just kill the one person, because then we're maintaining the value and dignity of two dogs. Nobody, no sane person would affirm that. But that is the logical conclusion of this way of thinking. And they have to, avoid it. But that is the logical conclusion that their thinking leads to. But, sorry, we're still looking here if you're watching the video. If not, I'll read these to you. They're kind of funny. So they give you, after they say, using animals as insults perpetuates speciesism. Therefore, instead of calling someone a chicken, you should say coward. Instead of calling someone a rat, you should say snitch. Instead of calling someone a snake, you should call them a jerk. Instead of calling someone a pig, you should call them repulsive. And finally, I'm sure they could come up with more, but instead of calling someone a sloth, you should call them lazy. What I think is funny is that, at least according to this tweet, now as I understand it, they did go back and issue a tweet saying, really, you shouldn't, say unkind things to anybody or about anybody. Yeah, it's cool. But this tweet seems to be totally fine with degrading people. Go ahead and call people stupid names, call people cowards, call people snitches, but just don't insinuate that those characteristics are similar to animals, because that would make an animal feel bad. If only animals could think and feel, then, this would make sense, but it doesn't. So, you might ask, obviously, this is very silly. Why would we even address something like this that so obviously is wrong? Why even take the time? Why do a podcast episode addressing something this absurd? It doesn't seem like a worthwhile use of our time. But as I said, and the reason I think this is a worthwhile thing to discuss is that I think this tweet, it represents a deeper worldview issue. I think it represents the fact that our society, our culture, has degraded to the point where people who think that cows and people have the same inherent value are taken seriously. And I'll say, this tweet got, if you're familiar with the term ratioed, this tweet got ratioed hard. What that means is there were a lot more people that commented on it or retweeted it in negative ways, like they were not happy with the tweet, than people who liked it. So this tweet overall got negative, not positive feedback. And I think that's a good sign. That I'm happy that that's the case. But there were still thousands of likes on this tweet. So to some extent, in our culture, there are people who think that this group, PETA, who equates the value of people and cattles, they think, wow, PETA, thank you for standing up for justice because you don't want to see cows degraded. I think this points to a real problem in Western society. And I think that this problem is mostly as a result of a deeper philosophical worldview. And I think we could categorize this worldview using kind of two main terms, and I'll give you definitions for them. And these are, as I said, this tweet, silly, kind of pointless. We're not actually very worried about the tweet itself or any harm that the tweet might do, but the harm that these worldviews will do, have done, and are doing currently, that harm is serious. And that harm we want to watch out for, and we want to combat it. And so I think we could kind of categorize the thinking that would lead to a tweet like this one in two ways, at least. I'm sure there's a lot of other, terms or labels that we could apply to it. But I think that this sort of worldview that equivocates the value of humanity with the value of animals and says that humanity and animals are equally valuable, have equal dignity, is evidence of what we could call a neo-Darwinist worldview and a materialist worldview. And I'm going to describe both of those terms now. So neo-Darwinism. This is actually a relatively loose term. It was one of those terms that, I was thinking, I think this term applies here, but I wasn't sure. So I went and looked it up and made sure that I was understanding what neo-Darwinism is. And I guess earlier in the 20th century, there was kind of a more specific use that this term was applied to. But today, in modern parlance, neo-Darwinism really is just used to refer to whatever the most current understanding of Darwin's theories were or are, so essentially neo-Darwinism is just the contemporary understanding of Darwin's theory, evolutionary theory. So I think today we could describe Darwin, the current contemporary understanding of Darwin's evolutionary theory could be described as follows. It is an anti-supernatural theory that posits a naturalistic origin for life that contradicts the Christian doctrine of creation. So, Darwinism, it posits a theory for where all of life came from, And that theory is, I use the term naturalistic. That means it is a theory that does not include God. It does not affirm the idea that God is responsible for creation and responsible for life. But instead, it is a theory that says that life as we know it and the world as we know it are purely the results of natural phenomenon. So that is neo-Darwinism, and you might ask, well, why, like, what connection is there between neo-Darwinism and this tweet? How are those two things connected at all? Well, I think it mostly comes in one phrase and then the word speciesism. And we already talked about the word speciesism, so I won't say much more about that. But it comes from the phrase other animals. So I'll read the sentence again. It says, calling someone an animal as an insult reinforces the myth that humans are superior to other animals. What do they mean by other animals? Obviously, you generally don't say other unless the thing that you are talking about is part of that category. So, you wouldn't say other unless you're counting humans as animals. We are, in their worldview, we are animals. Therefore, you should refer to humans and other animals. So you don't say humans and animals because that would suggest that humans and animals are two separate categories. But humans and other animals suggest that humans and animals are all part of one category, which is Animalia. So, obviously, that suggests a belief in the fact, or the idea, not a fact, definitely not a fact, the theory that all life has a common origin, namely, so what did Darwin call his book? The Origin of Species. So where did all the species come from? Well, one particular place, a single-celled organism way back in the primordial ooze. And we all, evolve from that one point. Therefore, we're animals just like a dog is an animal. And we have, even though maybe, by some metrics, humans might be more advanced, we use tools and all of that sort of stuff. We might be more advanced than dogs in our evolution, but we are not more valuable than dogs, and we don't have any unique claim to dignity that dogs do not have. That is how I can say that this tweet is neo-Darwinian, because it supports the idea and outright states the idea that humans are animals, and we are part of the family of animal kind. And one thing to understand, and this is where materialism comes in, is that Darwinism as a scientific theory is definitionally materialistic. And by materialistic, I don't mean, and here I'm going to define the term materialism. I'm not talking about like, Valley girls are so materialistic. Like they're so obsessed with material, and what they can buy and consumerism and all of that. Like that's not what I mean by materialism. What I'm talking about is the philosophical category of materialism. It is a subcategory of metaphysics within philosophy. And materialism, according to John Frame, who is a very wise theologian, man that I respect, his definition of materialism in his book, A History of Western Philosophy and Theology, his definition goes like this: the view that the universe is fundamentally material. So essentially, the materialism is the belief that there is nothing but matter. Everything you see, that's it. It's just matter. There is nothing beyond what you see. There is nothing supernatural. There is nothing beyond the natural. There is no spiritual. Materialists would reject the idea of a soul that is distinct from the body, whereas Christianity would recognize that you have a soul, you have a body, you have a mind, Materialism would reject these things and would say that everything we see is simply the result of natural laws and natural phenomenon. Of course, there's some implications of this worldview. It implies that there's no creator. It implies that we are obviously, if there's no creator, then we, humanity, cannot be created. We are simply accidents of science, accidents of the universe, and in fact, it suggests that the universe itself is an accident. Therefore, if you extrapolate from those things, it leads to many conclusions, which obviously are in stark contrast to what Scripture teaches. At this point, you might be thinking, TJ, this is a silly tweet. I think you might be reading a little bit too much into it. And honestly, maybe. You might be right. But I do think that it's really helpful for us to examine the non-Christian worldview. If we want to be able to combat it, if we want to be able to be bold, if we want to be able to approach the world and show them why their worldview is wrong and ours is right, well, then it is really helpful if you understand their worldview. And I think this neo-Darwin or neo-Darwinist materialist worldview is pretty common today. I would say there's actually probably a lot more people who, would call themselves vaguely spiritual, but there's definitely a fair amount of people who would put themselves in this category of, they're evolutionary. They believe in evolution. They hold to a materialistic metaphysic of the world. They think that everything is simply material. And so it's helpful for us to examine and understand and to prepare ourselves to, rebuke or debate this sort of worldview. I think a good example of this, and I talked about this, I think, a little bit in the last episode, but when Paul is in the Areopagus in Acts chapter 17, a lot of people point out the fact that he quotes the philosophers of the Greeks. And a lot of people point that out and say, look, like Paul was trying to connect with them. And maybe to some extent that's true, but I think really what he was doing in that instance was he was using that kind of as a portal to get into the conversation with them, and he was showing them, look, I know what you believe. I'm not just coming in here and ignorantly, but I do know what you believe, and here is why what you believe is wrong. And I think we as Christians need to be able to do that. If we cannot articulate the non-Christian worldviews, then it's very hard to interact with them and to explain to the people who hold them why those worldviews are incorrect. So, thinking about all this, there's really two things that I want to discuss. One of those is kind of we're going to look at just the end results of the neo-Darwinian materialist worldview. So we're going to look at the effects of that worldview on morality, on human dignity, on human responsibility, these sorts of things. And then we're going to look at the inconsistency of making moral claims from a neo-Darwinian materialist worldview. It is highly inconsistent to insist on moral evil or moral good, to even suggest those categories if you are a neo-Darwinian materialist. Those categories make no sense in that worldview, but what we'll find is that people who hold that worldview, at least they profess to hold that worldview, often will still make moral claims. And in fact, that's kind of what this tweet does. It insists that speciesism is wrong, but I don't think, and I think I can demonstrate, that this worldview has no basis to make such a moral accusation. So, first, let's look at the end results of the neo-Darwinian materialist worldview. I think the first and probably most important thing that we see among people who hold this view and the ramifications of this view is that it devalues human life. This viewpoint, it devalues human life. And the reason that it does that is because it rejects the imago Dei. The imago Dei is a theological phrase that we have pulled out of Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. You are probably familiar with this passage, but here it is. I'm going to read it because this phrase, imago Dei, comes right out of the passage. So this is, of course, Genesis 1 is the creation account, and this is the creation of man. It goes like this. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So, this passage, and another one that we're going to look at in just a moment, this passage sets mankind apart as unique. Why? Well, because mankind is made in the image of God himself. No other creature, we are all creatures, but no other creature apart from man was made in the image of God. And no other creature apart from man was given the dominion that man was given. God says, "Let them have dominion over," and then makes a list that includes all the rest of creatures. Every other creature is under the dominion of mankind. So we see that mankind is uniquely formed. We are made in God's image, and other creatures are not. And we are uniquely gifted in that we have been given the gift or the responsibility of dominion over the rest of creation. And what we see in this worldview that rejects the imago Dei and rejects the Dei himself, God, imago Dei means the image of God, Dei being, I believe, Latin for God, and imago, obviously Latin for image. When they reject the imago Dei, they are literally dehumanizing mankind. They are stripping mankind of what makes us human, what makes us who we are, and therefore they are dehumanizing us. And it's so funny because so much of our society right now is very kind of enamored, in a sense, and in like the negative sense, I guess, with this idea of dehumanizing, and that they are obsessed with the idea of dehumanization, and they hate it. So that's, they make claims that, everyone's racist and racism is bad because it's what? Dehumanizing. Well, it's funny because the whole atheistic, the whole Darwinistic worldview is dehumanizing in the truest sense of the term, in that it strips humanity of the thing that makes it valuable. It strips humanity of the thing that gives humanity value. And so the logical leap from saying that people have equal value with cattle to treating people as cattle is not a great leap. That's not a big chasm to jump across. When you have the rhetoric that people and animals are equally valuable, it's not a big jump to go from treating people to treating as animals. You cease once you decrease the value in your rhetoric and in your philosophy, in your science, and when you decide based on whatever presuppositions or pre-commitments that you have that humans are equally valuable to animals, it doesn't take long before you start to treat people like animals. And I think we see this so clearly in the instance of abortion. And this is not, this is not just an accusation to say, like, only non-Christians get abortions. Like, nope, I understand that Christians make this error as well. They make this grievous sin. They commit this murder as well. But at least the Christian worldview cannot consistently support the idea of abortion, but the Darwinistic, materialistic worldview has no issue with abortion. And that's why I think you see the left, which obviously is far more atheistic, far less Christian than the right. At least the right will act like they don't like abortion. I don't think they do nearly as much as they could to stop abortion, but at least they don't actively support it, whereas the left actively champions abortion because they have a godless worldview. They have a worldview that rejects the idea of the Imago Dei, and out of that rejection, they have what they understand to be the freedom to treat people like cattle. Well, what do you do with cattle? If the burden of owning cattle is greater than the benefit, what do you do with the cattle? You kill the cattle. That's exactly how they treat abortion. Abortion, it's killing, in their mind, just the unwanted. There's no moral value to the baby in the womb. It's just simply, some cells. And what I think is odd is that, according to the materialistic Darwinistic worldview, every person is just cells. And therefore, they're not making a claim that's unique about the infant in the womb as opposed to themselves. In most of their worldview, their atheistic worldview, just being cells, applies to them too. They're just cells. They've got no soul, no, nothing inherent in them that makes them valuable. They're just cells, just like the baby that they're murdering. So again, it's just a very inconsistent worldview. And it is literally, in the truest sense of the term, it is dehumanizing. So that is, I think, the first and probably one that we see very often, one of the end results of the neo-Darwinian materialist worldview. But I do think that there's another one, and it's very connected to the first, but rejection of the Imago Dei. So rejection of the image of God always either leads to or results from a rejection of the Dei, God himself. So there's another passage I wanted to read. It's Psalm 8, verses 3 to 8. It goes like this. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him? And the Son of Man that you care for him. Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, also the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. So something that you'll notice when you look at both this passage, which talks about the relationship between man and creatures, and man and God, both of these passages that address the dignity of mankind, Psalm 8, verses 3 to 8, and Genesis 1:26, both of these passages, they don't begin by discussing man, but they begin by discussing God. So in the Genesis passage, it said, God said, let us create man in whose image? Our image. In whose likeness? Our likeness. So this whole, the dignity of mankind begins with God, and it is rooted purely in the fact that we are created in his image. And if we are not created in his image, then we have no unique dignity apart from anything else. And then in the Psalm 8 passage, you see the same sort of thing play out. He is writing and he says, when I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you set in place. So again, when relating or discussing this idea of the dominion and the uniqueness of man, it is related to God and his role as creator. And so we have to understand that this neo-Darwinism, this materialist mindset or worldview, it always either leads to or it causes in us a rejection of God himself. Some people might, sort of innocently take on an evolutionary mindset innocently. They don't go into it thinking that this is, this is just my first step on the jolly path to rejecting God. But if you take it to its logical conclusion, it must reject God. Because if mankind comes from some other source, from natural phenomenon, natural laws, happy accidents of the universe, well, then we're not made in God's image. And if we're not made in God's image, then we do not have unique value. So, I think what we understand is that this sort of atheistic, materialistic worldview, it cannot sustain any sort of moral system. You cannot have a moral system in a valueless or dignityless universe. Morality comes from, morality is in respect to the value or dignity of persons. And if people do not have value and dignity, then there cannot be morality. So that brings us to, and I'm going to discuss that a little more because I know that's a bit of a claim to make. And so we're going to discuss that a little bit more in the next few minutes. So the second, main thing that I wanted to talk about in this podcast episode is the inconsistency of making any moral claims from within the neo-Darwinian materialist worldview. So I should say, this is a great area of inconsistency for atheists and materialists, because every human being makes moral claims. All of us do. We are all very quick, in fact, to proclaim our moral standards. And even atheists, people who reject the idea of any sort of objective morality that stands outside of mankind, that all mankind is accountable to, they still will make moral claims. Maybe you've heard, if you listen to the similar sort of things that I listen to, that everyone's a moral relativist until you punch them in the face. Then they're very quick to make a moral claim about how wrong that action was. And they, have to justify that somehow. And the problem is that from within the neo-Darwinian materialist worldview, you cannot justify a consistent basis for morality. And I'm going to give you 3 sort of reasons why that is the case, or really 2 reasons why that's the case, and then one spot where they are just inconsistent with their own neo-Darwinian worldview. So, why is it that they cannot justify their morality or their moral claims? Well, first, the atheistic and materialistic worldview is strictly deterministic. So, what do I mean by deterministic? Well, in the materialistic worldview, all of history, everything that's ever happened, everything that ever will happen, is simply an inevitable series of cause and effect. It's all just purely physics and chemistry in action all the way back to the Big Bang and all the way forward to the end of the universe. Everything is simply science. So the fact that you exist, all the decisions you make are purely chemical reactions and physics. Therefore, that is part and parcel of the materialistic worldview. Therefore, there is no genuine human agency. Agency means like will or initiative or motive. There cannot be genuine human agency or human will within a deterministic, a purely deterministic worldview such as materialism. Even your in this worldview, just even your thoughts, your emotions, they're just chemical reactions. All the stuff that you do and everything that you think and everything that you say is simply just they're links in the long chain of cause and effect, going all the way back to the Big Bang and going all the way forward to the heat death of the universe. So there is an obvious implication of that. And the implication is that within the materialist worldview, no one can do anything other than what they do. There is no choice. Willpower is a myth in the materialist worldview. There is no soul. There is no mind. Those things are purely biological phenomenon, and they are predetermined by the circumstances in which they exist. So essentially, in the materialist worldview, the mind and the patterns of thought that you have, all of that is determined simply by natural laws in the same way that gravity is. So, we have written down the law of gravity. Newton, you drop a ball, it falls down. That's the law of gravity, and it falls down at 9.8 meters per second squared. And that's just how it happens. Well, in the same way, in the materialist worldview, your mind functions in the same way. It's just dictated by the laws of nature. And you do not have freedom to think in any other pattern or down any other path than you currently are. And you cannot alter your path or your trajectory. It simply is as it is. Newton's laws of motion. An object in motion will stay in motion unless another equal and opposite force is exerted on it or something like that. I don't know all this stuff. But that is essentially what they would say how the human mind works, how everything works, because it all is simply subject to the laws of nature. So if that's the case, well, then it makes no sense in this worldview to call anything moral or immoral. Because nothing can change. There is nothing to be done about the state of things. And anything that you do was predetermined, and therefore is not an actually moral, positive, or negative action. Everything in the materialist worldview is simply purposeless atoms and molecules trudging on towards the end of the universe. And that's it. So there is no morality or immorality. Everything, you don't say that it's immortal for a tree in the forest to fall over. Did I say immortal? Immoral. It's not immoral, when a tree in the forest dies. You also probably don't say that it's immoral when, a lion in the wilderness kills a gazelle. It's killing, but you don't say it's immoral because it is simply the way of the universe. Well, likewise, if we are all simply animals and we are all simply material and we are all dictated purely by the laws of nature, then there is no morality. There cannot be morality. So, the atheistic, materialistic worldview is strictly deterministic and therefore has no basis for morality. But there's another reason why, or another way that we can demonstrate the inconsistency of the moral or the materialistic worldview, which is that if everything is simply matter, so if all that exists is matter, there is nothing beyond it, there is nothing supernatural, there is no soul, spirit, mind, none of those things, then there cannot be morals, which again, this is kind of an extrapolation from what we talked about, but this sort of idea is actually an application of an older philosophical conundrum that has been brought up by multiple different people, and I think it's important to note that at least one of these two people, David Hume, was an atheist himself. So this wasn't, this isn't theologians trying to poke holes in, materialism. This is something that a naturalistic, materialistic person himself, David Hume, pointed out as an issue with making moral statements within a materialistic worldview. Now, he had his own solution that he thought could solve this. I disagree with him. I don't think his solution solves it. I think his solution, and you can go look up David Hume, and he has a book called An Inquiry Concerning I think it's Human Morals or something like that. You can go read his book and look into his answer a bit more, but essentially his answer to this problem that I'm about to tell you about, his answer is, well, whatever people like, whatever brings pleasure, whatever is, whatever we are most pleased by, that is what is moral, and those things which cause discomfort or those things which we dislike, those things are immoral. And I think that even though he tried to argue against the idea that creates a completely subjectivistic morality, he argued that every person who's ever lived, apart from the deranged, have a common morality. And so he tried to create his own way to escape the problem that he is about to propose right here in this podcast, that he called the is-ought problem. G.E. Moore, another philosopher, he called this or at least a version of this, he called the naturalistic fallacy. So to put it simply, and I just got this off the internet, if you go online and you type in into Google, you type in the is-ought problem, you'll have a little thing that will pop up, and it will say the is-ought problem arises when a writer or speaker makes claims about what ought to be that are based solely on statements about what is. So let me say that again, just because it's one of those, like, philosophy statements are almost purposefully nonsensical sometimes and hard to follow. So the is-ought problem arises when a person makes claims about what ought to be. So these are moral claims, like you should do this. This is the moral thing to do. This problem arises when somebody makes that sort of claim based solely on statements about what is. So when it says what is there, statements about what is, those are statements about reality as it exists in front of us. So an example of this. Here is an example of the is statement. If you kick him in the shin, it will cause him pain. That is an is statement. It describes what will happen. If somebody is kicked in the shin, it will cause them physical pain. So then, many times people would hear that, and then they would imply an ought or a moral from it. The ought in this situation is, thus, you ought not to kick him. You shouldn't kick him. Why? Well, because it will cause him pain. Well, David Hume's problem with this is that there is no logical connection in this scenario between the is and the ought. So it is true. If you kick him in the shin, it will cause him pain. But that does not logically then follow that we ought not to kick him. Because, why is that? Well, why? The ought, the you ought not to kick him, relies on an unproven assumption, which is that pain is bad. So there's an assumption built in. If you say you ought not to kick him in the shins, that is based on the assumption, an unproven assumption, that pain is bad. And in the materialist worldview, there is no reason to insist that pain is bad. So this is a logical step that cannot be supported by a consistent materialist argument. So I think what David Hume would do is essentially he would just say, well, the person being kicked doesn't like it, and therefore we should all agree that it's morally wrong to kick him. But that's a separate sort of answer that I don't think actually satisfies the problem. And David Hume, I think himself, he acknowledged that that does not actually answer the problem, and David Hume insisted that we should not even attempt to connect our morality to an objective, sort of scientific worldview, that morality is not connected to that, and you cannot connect logic to morality, but morality is something that is far more based on emotion. And therefore, when something causes negative emotion, he would say that that is good evidence that that is an immoral action. But he does not connect morality with logic. And the reason he doesn't do that is because of this problem. Because he recognizes that within the materialistic worldview, there is no, in this example, there's no reason to insist in a materialist worldview that pain in and of itself is a bad thing. There's no reason to insist that pain should be, there's no reason to insist that pain should be avoided. And that is very clear, even if you go back to the deterministic thing that I talked about before. If everything is simply unfolding in the only way that it possibly can, then the pain is not something that has any moral value. Therefore, there's no logical reason to assume or to claim that pain should be avoided. But then there are some people that take the philosophical mode of the utilitarian view of morality, which is that, well, if he won't like being kicked, then you shouldn't kick him, because morality should simply be based on if somebody likes it or doesn't like the thing that you're doing. But even that is still kind of offset by the fact that the person doing the kicking probably likes it. So in the utilitarian view of morality, it is kind of a greatest good sort of idea. So it's whatever achieves the greatest good, the greatest amount of pleasure, or the greatest amount of satisfaction. That is what is moral, and that is what we should strive for, and that is what dictates whether or not something is moral. So if doing something leads to the greater overall satisfaction or pleasure of the society, well then, that is a moral thing to do. Well, if you use that sort of morality, which I think many people today, even non-atheists use, a lot of Christians even sort of fall into this mindset, and that's why so many Christians affirm LGBTQ people, because they think misguidedly, that affirming them, makes them feel better, and overall making people feel better is for their own good, and it is for the good of society, and therefore it is morally right to affirm LGBTQ people. So it's a utilitarian kind of argument there. But think about the kicking example again, just kind of a very clear elementary level example. In that example, obviously the person who's being kicked probably doesn't think that him being kicked is for the good of society, but the person doing the kicking likes it. The person doing the kicking is, I think it's safe to assume, finds the kicking pretty cathartic. They enjoy it. They're doing the kicking for a reason, and maybe they think that that they're exercising justice. This person deserves a good kick in the shin, and so it's going to teach them a lesson, which is going to be for the good of society, because maybe this person will stop being such a dingus in the future, and society will be bettered by that. So, from the utilitarian view of morality, there's no reason to assume that violence, like a good old shin kick, is a negative thing. So it's very inconsistent to say that there is any such thing as morals just purely from a materialistic worldview, because there is no moral value if everything is simply just matter. If everything is matter, then there is no inherent dignity to the world, and nobody is owed any sort of respect because, well, you're just a bunch of atoms. You are really, at your base level, no different from a pile of dirt, or for this instance, or for the case of PETA, you're no different than cattle, and therefore there is no reason why I should treat you any differently than I would treat a pile of dirt or cattle, because we all have the same origin, which is, just meaningless nothingness in the recesses of time, and we're all heading back to destruction again at the end of the universe. So, in the materialist worldview, there's no call or reason for morals, even though they very much like to utilize moral language when it benefits them. And then one just kind of final thing to point out about the inconsistency of this whole, like PETA's whole mindset with this tweet. They talk about speciesism, but they also very clearly, in their calling humans animals or equating us with animals, they very clearly put themselves kind of in the Darwinist camp. And what's very inconsistent about that is that Darwinism, in Darwinism, progress depends entirely upon competition. It's survival of the fittest. It's competition for resources. So you would think that if you're a true Darwinist who believes in that sort of competition, well then, humanity asserting our dominance over the animal kingdom is the most natural thing that you could imagine. That's what Darwinism suggests is the only real mode of progress. It is by, taking over. It is by driving out competition and by taking the resources that you need. So, in the Darwinist worldview, asserting dominance is a good thing. It leads to your species flourishing. So there's no reason in the Darwinist worldview to reject speciesism. Like the whole, in this worldview, the idea is that you want your species, as much as possible to thrive, even if that is at the expense of other species. That is part and parcel of the Darwinist schema, the whole pattern of Darwinist thought. So in the neo-Darwinist worldview, there's no real scientific or moral reason to oppose so-called speciesism. That's kind of the name of the game in Darwinism, speciesism. Like, my species is going to beat your species, we're going to get the resources, we're going to thrive, and your species is going to fail, and we're going to win. But guess what? The Christian worldview does actually give a sound, consistent reason for why we should treat animals well. And what's funny is, PETA, coming from this neo-Darwinist worldview, they want to argue that we should treat animals well, but their worldview gives no justification for why animals should be treated well, or for that matter, why people should be treated well. But obviously the Christian worldview does give a sound and consistent reason for why animals, and obviously humans, should be treated well and with dignity. In the case of animals, well, it's because they are a gift that God has placed under our stewardship. He has given them to us to steward as part of his creation that he has given us dominion over. They are not our equals, but they are good gifts that should be cared for. But then obviously with humans, we treat mankind with dignity, because they are made in the image of God, in the image of our Creator. I love this. I think it's in like James 3 or 4. James rebukes people who, with the same tongue, they curse people. With the same tongue, they praise God, and they curse people made in the image of God. So there's this inconsistency. If you are a Christian who treats people inhumanely, that is inconsistent. But if you're a Darwinian, if you're a materialist who treats people inhumanely, that is perfectly consistent, because you don't believe humans have any inherent dignity or value. But Christians, we have a worldview that can support saying that people have value, that people have dignity, that people are worth something. And, in fact, we could say the same about animals. So, again, I think this just all sort of shows that the Christian worldview is the most consistent worldview if you want to claim that morality exists and that people, should treat each other well and that they should treat animals well or that they should steward creation well. Christianity gives the most consistent worldview in order to make those claims. But if you have a materialist, Darwinian, evolutionary worldview, there's no real reason for you to claim any of those things and no consistent basis, no logical basis for you to do so. So the bottom line, we're about finished here. Yes, this is a very silly, inconsequential tweet, but I think the worldview that it represents is destructive. It is a wicked worldview that will lead to, as the segment is titled, it will lead to the death of the West. It will lead to the death of any society that it takes part of or takes over. Because any society that does not value humankind, well, society is made up of humans. So if you dehumanize people and you strip them of their integrity, their value, their dignity, then there is no basis upon which to have law or to have morality, and it destroys any sort of social cohesion that we might have based on mutual respect and care for one another. So, Christians should oppose Darwinism. Christians should oppose materialism, and we should present the true and consistent worldview that gives a real basis for human dignity. And so I charge you now at the end of this episode to go and to be bold and to oppose these wicked worldly philosophies and to show them why their philosophy is inconsistent, their philosophy is wicked, and ours, the Christian philosophy, the Christian worldview, the Christian theology is right, and it is good, it is better, and will have better results for the world. And then you invite them and you command them, repent, turn from your sins, and trust in the God who created you. That is what I encourage each of you to do with the people in your life who might be subscribing to these sorts of worldviews. So, thank you so much for listening. I would love it if you would follow the podcast. If you listen to it on audio, hit subscribe. Maybe go give me a rating. If you watch online, leave a comment, leave a like, hit follow, whatever it is you can do on whichever platform that you're using. Thank you so much for tuning in. Grateful for you, and have a great rest of whatever remainder of day you have left.